Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are and whenever you are. Hello, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about the American Revolution and some of our early founding documents. Particularly, we're going to be speaking this week about the Articles of Confederation and the United States Constitution. Now, I want to make just some kind of cursory comments and observations about the war, but I'm not going to go too deep into the military aspects of the conflict. I'm not a military historian, I'm a social historian, which means I'm more concerned with the way in which wars had an impact upon people back home. And so when we think about the American Revolution, the one thing that I believe is absolutely true is that it was a political revolution. Obviously, one of the things that the war accomplishes is it allows for the formation of a self-governing institution to ultimately develop. But there is a question as to the degree to which the American Revolution was a social revolution. And what we mean by this, of course, is to what degree did the lives of people actually change as a result of the war itself? So when we take a look at the lives of slaves, Native Americans, and women, we would conclude that in the immediate aftermath of the war, the lives of those three groups of people doesn't change that dramatically. There is, in fact, a shift in women in that this idea of Republican motherhood begins to develop. And this is the idea that women are the educators of morality and virtue, and they are the ones who are to educate their sons in the ways that they should go with respects to those ideas, virtue and morality and what have you. And so some individuals believed that women should have a more robust education. That is, people like Dr. Benjamin Rush believed that women should be given more of an education. And those types of ideas, of course, are progressive. They suggest that women should be more fully educated, but the reality is that there's something deeply patriarchal about it, because the reason why women are being educated, at least with respects to Republican motherhood, is so that they can better educate their men to do the work that the men will eventually do in their lives. So one of the things I want you to be thinking about this week is the degree to which the American Revolution was itself a social revolution. Now, as far as the war itself is concerned, for the most part, the United States, or what would become the United States, I wouldn't say that we were the grandest fighting force that the world had ever seen. When Washington takes control over the Continental Army, he really has to forge an army from the ground up. He's really dealing with just folks who have really no training. They're not very equipped well, and they basically don't have very many supplies. There's no navy whatsoever to speak of. In fact, following the Battle of Saratoga in 1777, the French will come to align with the colonials, and thanks to the French Navy, we ultimately would be successful in ousting out the British, particularly during the Battle of Yorktown in 1783, which is in fact the final battle of the American Revolution. But the thing that is very true, and Washington realizes this very early on, is that if he's going to defeat the British, he's going to have to employ a strategy of just continue fighting, continue on. It's the idea that we simply have to outlast the British, and in many ways, that's what happened. George Washington is by no means the creme de la creme, if you will, of generals. I know we like to believe that he was the greatest general we'd ever seen, and the Continental Army was the greatest fighting force we'd ever seen, but that's just not the case. Early on, Washington has a few very small victories at the battles of Trenton and Princeton, but these aren't game-changing victories for Washington. They're important victories, particularly in 1776, because the war hadn't been going on very well for the colonials. And at the end of 1776, some of the enlistments were going to come up, and the morale was low. And so it was kind of important for Washington to get some of these early victories. But for the most part, we really did outlast the British. And with the alliance of the French following 1777, that really enables us to be victorious. In the war itself, That, of course, is going to have a massive amount of reverberation for the Americans because now they are going to be able to solidify their position as a self-governing people, right? They will no longer be subjects to the British. And so the war will come to an end. It ends actually in 1783, 2 years after the final battle at Yorktown. It comes to an end with the Peace of Paris, with the Treaty of Paris. And effectively what happens is the British promise that they will remove themselves from forts that they had built, which they don't necessarily do right away. And they promise to recognize and treat the United States as a sovereign, independent country, which, as we will see, they don't always do that either. Okay, and in fact, some of the tensions that are not resolved from the American Revolution ultimately boil over into another conflict known as the War of 1812, and we'll talk about that conflict later down the line. But when the war is over, it is now time for the Americans to sort of figure out what's going on and how are they going to govern themselves. And so initially, the Americans adopt a form of a constitution called the Articles of Confederation. Now, the Articles of Confederation were initially drafted, I believe it was in 1776, but they're not adopted by the Continental Congress until 1781. So effectively, the entire war was fought without some kind of solidified documentation of a government, some kind of institution, if you will. And that, of course, is going to complicate fighting the war. One of the things that Washington is going to recognize as he's fighting the conflict is that he can't get his soldiers paid. In fact, many of the soldiers go without pay, and that's going to be a huge problem for some folks, particularly farmers, after the war is over. We'll talk about that here in a second. But he's also recognizing that he can't get food to his troops. And so as the war progresses, some people begin to recognize that there is a need for a stronger central government in order to get things done. And Washington would be one of those individuals, while others, including Thomas Jefferson, would say that the purpose of the war was to throw off the shackles of tyranny and have no major strong central government. Now, the reason why I bring that up is because the Articles of Confederation was created, and it was created early on in the war. And what the Articles of Confederation did was it found its power, for example, with the states. The power of the government didn't come from the people. That's one of the reasons why the Constitution begins with "we the people." It wants the world to know that the power of the government comes from the people and not from the states. But the Articles of Confederation, it found its power from the states. The states were the ones who created it. But the states created a very weak central government. The Articles of Confederation had very little teeth. And in fact, many of the weaknesses of the Articles were economic weaknesses. For example, there was no ability for the Congress to collect taxes. They could not force or compel the states to pay any taxes. And this is a real problem because there's a lot of debt that's following the American Revolutionary War, and someone's got to pay off that debt. And so ultimately, the Articles of Confederation, they're weak, and they will eventually have to be thrown out. And that is going to happen following a rebellion known as Shays' Rebellion. We have a video on that for you this week. But it really boils down to the fact that you have a lot of farmers who come back home, and a lot of the states are enacting taxes against these people. And these are oftentimes war vets who come home. They didn't get a paycheck. They come home to taxes that they have to pay, and they can't pay them. And the federal government is so weak under the Articles that it ultimately creates pressure, and that pressure explodes with Shays' Rebellion. And this is really problematic for a lot of our founding fathers, and you have to understand this. Many of our founding fathers believed that the best of society should be the ones who govern. That is, the best educated, obviously white elite men. They very much feared mob rule. Indeed, oftentimes we talk about the United States as being a democracy, but that's not what we are. In fact, you hear it all the time. We have to knit our democracy back together. We have to keep our democracy, but we're not a democracy. We are a republic. That is the form of government that we created under the U.S. Constitution. And the reason for that is the men who wrote the Constitution were deeply fearful of democracy. They were deeply fearful of mob rule because they did not think that lower class people should govern or rule. And when you have things like Shays' Rebellion or any kind of revolt among the lower classes of people, then that threatens the social position of the upper echelon of society. People like Alexander Hamilton were deeply, deeply fearful of mob rule. They were deeply afraid of democracy because they did not think that, Joe Blow Plowboy should be allowed to rule. What does he know? What does he have invested in the government? Nothing. Rather, folks like Hamilton thought that people like Hamilton should govern. The elite, the wealthy, white men, educated, that kind of thing. And so when Shays' Rebellion finally gets put down, there's a massive call to amend the Articles of Confederation because it's becoming painfully obvious that the government cannot continue on in this way with the Articles. And so a convention is called to basically amend the Articles. But in the end, the Articles are so bad that they're eventually tossed out. And what replaces them is the United States Constitution. Now, there's a lot to say about the Constitution of the United States, but you need to be aware of some of the compromises that made up the Constitution. And the compromises would include things like the Virginia Plan and the New Jersey Plan ultimately coming together in what becomes known as the Connecticut Compromise, because ultimately what the founders decided upon was that we would have three branches of government for our new country, and they would be an executive branch, which is headed by the presidency. There would be a judicial branch, which would be the Supreme Court. But then they also created a legislative branch, and the legislative branch writes laws. And ultimately, the decision is to make a two-house legislature. We call that a bicameral legislature. But people began to ask questions about how should the states be represented. As you may or may not know, in the House of Representatives, the number of representatives that each state gets is predicated upon their population. So the more people you have, the more representatives you get in the House. By contrast, in the Senate, you have everyone has equal representation, and that would be 2 senators per state. Now, the reason why that exists is because of the Virginia and New Jersey plans. Initially, James Madison, who's known as the father of the Constitution, he comes forward with a plan known as the Virginia Plan, and he basically says there should be a two-house legislature, a bicameral legislature, but everyone should get equal representation. I'm sorry, not equal representation. Everyone should get a representation based upon their population. And the reason why that worked out for James Madison is because Virginia was a big state. And so if all the states got representation based upon their population, then big states would have more control in the government. New Jersey came back with their own plan, and they said, no, everyone should get equal representation. That way we're all equal, small states and big states. And in the end, we sort of combined the two. But when you start talking about representation in the government, one of the things that existed then that thankfully doesn't exist now is the institution of slavery. And so there was a huge question about whether or not slaves should be counted towards representation. And in the end, the decision that is made is to have what we call the 3/5 compromise. And you need to be aware of what the 3/5 compromise is. But effectively, the choice to count slaves in a 3/5 way was predicated on this fact. If we were to count the slaves 100% instead of 3/5, then slave states would have more representation, but they would also therefore have to pay more taxes. And Southerners liked the idea of counting slaves so that they could have more representation, but they didn't like the idea of counting slaves because they'd have to pay taxes. And of course, the North would be just the opposite. So they come up with this compromise. Instead of ending the institution of slavery, instead, we write slavery into the United States Constitution. And in fact, I don't know if that 3/5 compromise has ever actually been overthrown or tossed out of the Constitution. It may actually still be written in there, as is a fugitive slave law. And so as we move forward, one of the things we have to recognize is that slavery as an institution is going to be constitutionally protected. It's going to exist, okay? Now, once the Constitution is written and signed in 1787, it then has to go back to the states, and 9 states out of 13 had to ratify the Constitution. And there was this huge debate that takes place between a group known as the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. I'm running out of time here. I don't want to go on too long, so make sure you know who the Federalists and Anti-Federalists are. But basically, the Federalists were individuals who made arguments in favor of ratifying the Constitution. These would be people like Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, John Jay. And then the Anti-Federalists would have been those who did not want to ratify the Constitution. And the biggest issue that the Anti-Federalists had was that the Constitution did not have a Bill of Rights. And so one of the things that ultimately happens is the Federalists say, hey, if you sign on to this document now, we will draft a Bill of Rights for you later, which they do. In 1791, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution are passed, okay? So you're going to want to know what those amendments are, at least have a sense of what they are. Excuse me. You'll also want to know a basic breakdown of what the Constitution looks like, particularly the first three articles, which create, in this order, Article 1 creates the congressional branch of government. Article 2 creates the executive branch, that's the presidency, and then Article 3 creates the judicial branch. Some key ideas that we sometimes tote around as being constitutional, which really aren't, are this idea of separation of church and state. Nowhere in the Constitution is that phrase founded. And the other thing, and we'll talk about this later, is the idea of judicial review. That is, that the Supreme Court has the right to say that a congressional action is unconstitutional. That is also not constitutional. But we'll talk about where that came from. Okay, so that's a real kind of quick and dirty overview of what we're going to be looking at this week. I could go on and on and on and on and on, but I know you don't want to listen to a 25-minute lecture here. So we'll leave it at that. If you have any questions or want me to elaborate on anything, please let me know. But hopefully the other resources for this week will help fill in the gaps if I've left any there. So, as always, go in peace, be warm and filled. May the force be with you, live long and prosper, and may the odds forever be in your favor. Have a great week, guys, and as always, I hope you enjoy the content.